On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I'm coming to you from Tombstone, Arizona. We go back to October 26, 1881, and take a look at the most famous gunfight in American history. And as some people have said before, if you think you knew about the gunfight at the OK Corral, well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. So stay tuned for this edition of Crime Chronicles as we look at the gunfight at the OK Corral. On October 26, 1881, a 30-second gunfight took place near the old Kindersley Corral in the mining-rich town of Tombstone, Arizona. The gunfight at the OK Corral pitted the town marshal, Virgil Earp, along with his two temporary deputies and younger brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, plus Wyatt's friend John Henry, or Doc Holliday, against members of a loosely organized group of cattle rustlers and horse thieves called the Cochise County Cowboys, or just the Cowboys, which included Ike Clanton, his younger brother Billy, plus brothers Frank and Tom McClory, and William Claiborne. The gunfight has been the subject of books and films and historical study practically since it happened, and did much to shape worldwide perceptions of the American Old West in the 19th century. In brief, what happened was this. The afternoon of October 26, 1881, it was much cooler on that day than it is now, when it's like 90 degrees out here. Four men, three town marshals of Tombstone, Virgil Earp, his younger brothers Wyatt and Morgan, accompanied by a friend of theirs, or a friend of Wyatt's, named Doc Holliday, John Henry Holliday. They met somewhere in this area here, we'll show you more specifically later on Fremont Street here in Tombstone. And a gunfight ensued. When the gunfight was done, three men, Billy Clanton, Frank LaCory, and Tom McClory, were dead. Two of the Earp brothers were wounded. And far from settling anything, it merely was the start of something even bigger. Despite its name, the gunfight did not take place within or next to the OK Corral that faced Allen Street. It took place in a narrow lot on the side of C.S. Fly's photography studio on Fremont Street, 6 doors west of the OK Corral's rear entrance. About 30 shots were fired in 30 seconds. In addition to the 3 men killed and the 3 men wounded, there were 3 others directly involved. Ike Clanton and William Claiborne ran away and were uninjured. Wyatt Earp fought but was not wounded. The gunfight merely exacerbated the feud between the Cowboys and the Earps and would lead to more deaths. Before we talk about the gunfight, the people involved in it, let's take a look at the history of Tombstone. Prior to the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, there wasn't much history of Tombstone. The town was only founded a few years before that. You're looking at a statue here of the man who found Tombstone, Arizona. Now, the name is Edwin Schieffelin, and Edwin Schieffelin came here with the idea of making a lot of money. He was convinced there was great money to be made in mining here in Tombstone, and that was in the 1870s. Now, people who talked to him said it was a fool's errand, and they said the only thing you will find in this area is your own tombstone. Well, sure enough, Schieffelin struck it rich in the mining business, and so when it came time to name the town, he decided to name it Tombstone in honor of that put down he received a few years earlier. Tombstone is located in Cochise County, Arizona, about 30 miles from the Mexican border. At its founding, it had a population of just 100, and only 2 years later, in late 1881, the population was more than 7,000 white men, plus an unknown number of white women and children, plus a small Chinese and Mexican population, making it the largest boomtown in the American Southwest. What was Tombstone like in the 1880s? Accounts differ, but while it was certainly dirty and primitive by modern standards, by the standards of that day, sometimes it was called the Paris of the desert. Now, although it attracted a very unsavory crowd, people looking to make a quick buck with mining and stuff like that, a lot of drinking, gambling, that type of thing, a lot of prostitution, which operated legally, by the way, and which the Earps helped manage. The Earps made money off gambling, off saloons, off prostitution, but it also had reading rooms, had book clubs, museums, things of that nature. So it was an interesting place in some ways. Silver mining attracted many professionals and merchants, many of whom brought their wives and families. With them came churches and ministers. By 1881, the town boasted fancy restaurants, a bowling alley, 4 churches, an ice house, a school, an opera house, 2 banks, 3 newspapers, and an ice cream parlor in the days before refrigeration, along with 110 saloons, 14 gambling halls, and numerous brothels, all of which operated openly and legally. There were several gold rushes in the United States or United States territories in the 19th century, perhaps the most famous being the one in San Francisco of 1849, the gold rush of 1849, and sometime later the gold rush in Alaska, the Klondike gold rush. There was also a gold rush here. And the main mineral that was mined here in Tombstone, which put it on the map and which attracted thousands of prospectors and people seeking a fortune, was silver. There are a lot of misconceptions and myths about the American West, the founding of it, I should say, in the 19th century. One of those misconceptions is that it was about cowboys and Indians. Should I say colonizers and First Nation people. But it was really more about minerals. Minerals played a bigger part in the settling of the West, cowboys and Indians. However, what you're talking about here in Tombstone kind of melds both of those factors, because not so much Native Americans, but the activities of cowboys and mining were a big part of the story of Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral. Silver mining was a big source of wealth and brought many people to Tombstone. But when people arrived, they needed horses for work and transportation and cattle for beef and dairy. So not only was mining a primary industry in Tombstone, but its proximity to the Mexican border also made it ripe for cattle rustling and horse theft. Let's take a look at the principal players involved in the gunfight at the OK Corral, both the actual participants and the people who were ancillary, but nevertheless very important to this narrative, this story. But let's start with the person who was most often associated with the gunfight, and that was a man named Wyatt Earp, and how his start in Illinois brought him here to Tombstone and made him one of the most famous figures of the American West. Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp was born in Monmouth, Illinois, the fourth of 6 children born to Nicholas and Virginia Earp. Wyatt Earp spent his early years in Illinois and Iowa. During his teen years, the United States was embroiled in the Civil War. His 3 older brothers, Newton, James, and Virgil, fought in the Union Army, while a teenaged Wyatt and his younger brothers, Morgan and Warren, assisted their father in working the fields. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, Wyatt, his father, and his younger siblings had moved to California. Wyatt spent time hauling freight while exploring the western states and territories, establishing a reputation as a gambler and gunfighter in San Bernardino, California. Wyatt worked for the Union Pacific Railroad as railroads continued to expand in the West. There he got involved with boxing and gambling, both of which were illegal in some jurisdictions. Wyatt Earp's law enforcement and political career began in 1869 when he rejoined his family in Lamar, Missouri. Wyatt's father, Nicholas Earp, resigned his elected position of constable, and Wyatt was appointed to fill his unexpired term. Wyatt was elected to the post later that year, barely defeating his half-brother Newton. As was the pattern throughout his childhood and adult life, Earp's stay in Lamar was short-lived. In January 1870, Wyatt married Urilla Sutherland, only to lose her to typhoid while she was pregnant with their first child. By 1871, he had moved to Van Buren, Arkansas, where he was charged with stealing a horse. Wyatt Earp's next law enforcement job was in Wichita, Kansas, from 1874 to 1876. In Wichita, Earp established a reputation as a tough, stoical law enforcer, though it is believed he never killed anyone while there. But he lost the job in Wichita because of alleged financial misdeeds. After leaving Wichita, Earp took a job as deputy marshal in Dodge City, Kansas, a city immortalized by the fictional radio and television series Gunsmoke. Earp's reputation grew during his brief stay in Dodge City, thanks in part to the presence of his sidekick, William Bat Masterson, already a living legend for his military exploits. Earp and Masterson gained a reputation for fighting crime and corruption, while also acquiring the nickname the Fighting Pimps for supplementing their incomes from gambling houses and brothels. Wyatt Earp left Kansas for Texas, and then, at the urging of his brother Morgan, he left for Arizona, hoping to strike it rich in the silver mining business. He settled in Tombstone, Arizona in 1879, along with several of his brothers. He and his brothers invested in several mining claims and water rights. He worked as a deputy sheriff before working as a deputy marshal under his brother Virgil. Neither he nor his brothers had worked on ranches or farms, a factor which brought them into conflict with some ranchers and farmers in Tombstone. The Earps were more interested in urban businesses like gambling and prostitution than farming and ranching. What kind of personalities did the Earps have? Although we tend to kind of lump them together, we forget they were individual people, had their own individual personalities. And let's talk about Wyatt for a second. Wyatt was known as a man of very few words. He was not exactly a people person. He was not a glad-hander, and therefore that thwarted some of his political aims. There's a term in law enforcement today known as the use of force continuum. In other words, a law enforcement officer is supposed to arrive at a scene or a situation, and depending on what the situation demands, of course, the police officer is supposed to use the least amount of force necessary to do what needs to be done. And that usually starts with a verbal command, and then it has to escalate if things get worse, if the person doesn't comply. Wyatt Earp would not be a fan of the use of force continuum. Chances are, if he had anything to say to anybody or had any questions, they had better answer quick, because he was very quick to punch. Wyatt, I should say, would usually hit first and ask questions later. Now, although Wyatt Earp is by far the most famous of the Earp brothers, he wasn't the only Earp brother. In fact, there was 6 Earp brothers. Let's take a look at 2 brothers involved in the gunfight at the Corral, that being his older brother, Virgil Earp, and Wyatt's younger brother, Morgan Earp. Virgil was the second oldest of the Earp brothers and the oldest of the 3 in Tombstone in 1881. He was born in Kentucky in 1843 and eventually moved to Iowa. He married a Dutch immigrant while in his teens, but his wife and son left him while he was serving on the side of the Union during the Civil War. Virgil eventually remarried before making his way to Arizona in 1879 with his brothers. After a series of political maneuverings, Virgil Earp was appointed by Tombstone Mayor John Clum to the prestigious and well-paying position of permanent town marshal. Morgan Earp, the youngest of the Earp brothers, was born in Iowa in 1851, and like his older brothers, he spent the first 25 years of his life going from town to town and working various jobs, including some in law enforcement in the developing Western territories, before settling in Tombstone in the late 1870s. Wyatt always felt protective of his kid brother. Though not universally liked by the townspeople, the Earp brothers tended to protect the interests of the town's business owners and residents as opposed to the interests of farmers and ranchers. However, Wyatt helped protect one cowboy outlaw, Curly Bill Brocious, from being lynched after Brocious accidentally killed Tombstone Town Marshal Fred White, Virgil's predecessor. It would not be the last time these 2 men met. The 3 marshals involved in the gunfight at the OK Corral were Virgil Earp, Wyatt Earp, and Morgan Earp. Who was the 4th person on their side in this fight? Let's take a look at the life of John Henry Holliday, also known as Doc Holliday. But to do that, the story starts not here in Arizona, but in my hometown of Griffin, Georgia. John Henry Holliday was born in Griffin, Georgia in 1851. Holliday received the finest education available to any child growing up in Georgia at that time. In the early 1870s, he attended dental school at what is now the University of Pennsylvania School of Dentistry in Philadelphia, finishing at age 20. As the minimum age for practicing dentistry was 21, he had to wait 5 months for his degree to be conferred. He practiced dentistry first in Missouri and later in his home state of Georgia. While in Georgia, Holliday contracted tuberculosis, an often deadly condition in the 19th century. Like many others with TB, Holliday made his way west, as the dry air was thought beneficial to tubercular patients. Eventually, Holliday became better known for his gambling, gunfighting prowess, and his prickly, disagreeable, violent personality than for his refined education and dental skills. He left dentistry behind and assumed the lifestyle of many other wayward Westerners of the period, constantly in conflict, often on the wrong side of the law, and never settling anywhere for too long. Doc Holliday had reportedly been in 9 shootouts during his life. It seems that wherever he went, men he encountered were killed, although it has only been verified that he killed 3 men. One well-documented episode occurred on July 19, 1879, when Holliday and his business partner, former Deputy Marshal John Webb, were seated in their saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico. A man named Mike Gordon got into a loud argument with one of the saloon girls whom he wanted to take home with him. Gordon stormed from the saloon and began firing his revolver into the building. Before Gordon could get off his second shot, Holliday killed him. Holliday was acquitted of murder charges. Throughout his short life, no matter how often he was tried for killing someone, Holliday somehow managed to wriggle off the hook. How did Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday become such fast friends? The story goes back to Dodge City, Kansas, when Wyatt Earp was in law enforcement there. On one occasion, Wyatt Earp was outnumbered in trying to deal with some ruffians. Doc Holliday was inside playing cards and drinking, as he usually did. He came outside, heard the commotion, came outside, and he saw a person standing behind Wyatt Earp about to put a bullet in Wyatt's back. And Doc Holliday shot and killed this outlaw before he could shoot Wyatt Earp. And that cemented the lifelong relationship that these two men had. Doc Holliday moved to Arizona, eventually to Tombstone, where he was reunited with his friend Wyatt Earp. Accounts differ on Holliday's relationship with Virgil Earp. By some accounts, they got along well. By other accounts, Virgil had no use for Doc Holliday, thinking him mouthy, ill-tempered, and a troublemaker. A significant figure in the story of Doc Holliday is a woman who was his on-again, off-again girlfriend, intimate lover, and her name was Big Nose Kate Elder. And now I'm here at Big Nose Kate's saloon. No one's really sure how Kate got the name Big Nose. Was it because she indeed had a large nose, or was it because she was always nosy? We don't know. One thing's for sure, I think your love life, your relationship has problems. Talk about love-hate relationship. What about Big Nose Kate and Doc Holliday? Born Mary Catherine Horoni in the 1840s, Kate Elder, as she became known, was a Hungarian immigrant who worked as a prostitute, a madam, a gambler, a saloon keeper, and baker, both before and after her relationship with Doc Holliday in Tombstone. Even though she was orphaned, Elder was well educated, but nevertheless chose a lifestyle more befitting a woman with few legitimate options. She is the only woman known to have had a long-term relationship with Doc Holliday. Another important figure in this event is a man who was not involved in the gunfight at the OK Corral, at least not, he was not a participant. And that was a man named Johnny Behan. He was the sheriff here in Tombstone. John Harris Behan was born in Missouri in 1844. He served in several law enforcement positions and worked other jobs in several states and territories. Not long after his arrival in Arizona, he served in the territorial legislature before serving as sheriff in another Arizona county and finally as sheriff of Cochise County, which included Tombstone. Unlike the Earps, Sheriff Behan was generally sympathetic to the interests of the rural ranchers and even the Cowboys. It was Behan who brought another key player into the saga, a young Jewish woman of German ancestry named Josephine or Sadie Marcos, where they lived as common-law spouses, even though both had no qualms about intimate relationships with others. Marcos was only 17 when she began her relationship with a 33-year-old Sheriff Behan, who promised to marry her but never did. The job of daily law enforcement here in Tombstone back in the 1880s didn't rest with the sheriff. The sheriff's primary task, although he was entitled the chief law enforcement officer for the county, his primary job was to collect taxes. This would seem like rank corruption now, and with good reason, but this was common back in the 19th century among not just law enforcement, but civil servants. The sheriff would go out and collect taxes, and he was entitled to keep a certain percentage of the taxes he collected. Daily task of law enforcement fell to the town marshals. The town marshal at the time of Johnny Behan's term as sheriff was Virgil Earp, and he deputized his two younger brothers, Morgan and Wyatt. What about Sheriff Behan? Where did he stand? Well, Sheriff Behan was a consummate politician in a small town, and his primary job was to collect taxes. Of course, he wanted to make the money associated with that, but he also realized he had a target on his back by going around collecting so much money. And so he decided to enlist some security. Although he didn't exactly go with a reputable company to provide security for him, he had no deputy sheriff, so he had a few, but they didn't help him for that much from time to time. And so he enlisted the services of some of the Cowboys, namely a man named Curly Bill Brocious, to protect him when he went out and made collections. On top of that, Sheriff Behan knew that the Cowboys had no respect for law and order and would not pay taxes willingly. So he arranged with Curly Bill Brocious and some other of the Cowboy leadership to, one, make sure their Confederates, their associates, paid their taxes, and two, that he did not get robbed and or killed while collecting those taxes. Sheriff Behan, although not much of a fighter, certainly not a gunfighter, and not much with his fist, he was a very adept politician. He knew how to make a friend out of an enemy. William Curly Bill Brocious was born in Indiana in the 1840s. Although he was likable, a gregarious person who walked into a saloon and bought drinks for everyone, he had no real occupation other than stealing cows and horses, and was constantly in conflict with the law everywhere he went, before and after arriving in Tombstone. Brocious did not participate in the gunfight at the OK Corral, but but he would figure prominently in the aftermath.
The gunfight at the OK Corral pitted the Earps and Doc Holliday, that being the town marshals and their associate Doc Holliday, against the quote-unquote Cowboys, who were headed loosely by a man named Ike Clanton. Now, before we take a look at Ike Clanton, let's take a look at cowboys. Well, the word of the term cowboy is now part of the American lexicon, and it's usually a term of endearment. After all, how many Dallas Cowboys fans are out there? And cowboys are the stuff of romance and so forth. But when the term first came about in the 19th century, it was a slur, not a compliment at all. And it referred to men who stole cows for a living. And to be called a cowboy was a put down. It was the same as being called a cow thief.
One man wrote, "A cowboy is a rustler, and a rustler is a synonym for desperado, a bandit, an outlaw, and horse thief." The San Francisco Examiner wrote, "Cowboys are the most reckless class of outlaws in that wild country, infinitely worse than the ordinary robber." During the 1880s in Cochise County, it was an insult to call legitimate cattlemen a cowboy. The cowboys teamed up for various crimes and came to each other's aid.
What kind of activities were the cowboys involved in? As I said, the term cowboy was a slur back in those days, not like it's used today. Keep in mind, I'm not sure exactly how far we are from the Mexican border, but this county adjoins the border with Mexico. And so what the cowboys would do is they would go across the Mexican border, rustle cows or horses or whatever they get their hands on, especially cattle though, and bring them back here to Arizona and sell them cheap to businesses around here, slaughterhouses, butchers, people like that, who would in turn sell it for a higher price. Organized crime cannot operate unless there's a market for what they do. And some criminal organizations specialize in stealing or manufacturing or distributing illegal goods like, say, illegal drugs. Other organized crime groups, this is like the Cowboys, take something that's a product that's legal, as in beef cattle, and they get it at a cheap price. And so people are willing to overlook the fact that these are stolen goods here as long as they can get it cheap. And that's the kind of business the Cowboys were in. Where was the moral outrage among people here in Arizona when it came to consuming, selling, etc., stolen beef? The answer is there was no outrage for a number of reasons. One, they got it cheap. Two, they cared nothing for the people on the other side of the border, i.e. Mexicans. On the other hand, though, people on the other side of the border weren't exactly pure and blameless all the time either. There were plenty of raids by banditos from Mexico who would come into Arizona and other border areas and conduct similar activities here and then escape back to Mexico. Another thing that made it ripe for that kind of activity was the fact it was the topography of the area between here and the Mexican border. It was very easy to not only transport cattle or horses, as the case may be, but also to conceal them if somebody came looking for them. The lead character on the other side of this gunfight was a man named Ike Clanton, who was a leader of some sort among the cowboy faction here in Tombstone. Let's take a look at his life and what got him to this point.
Joseph Isaac Clanton was born around 1847 in Missouri. Although he had never served in the military, his father Newman and other members of his family served in the Confederacy during the Civil War before making their way to Tombstone in the late 1870s. Proving the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Ike's father Newman, or Old Man Clanton, was killed by Mexican troops while on a cattle rustling mission in Mexico.
There were a lot of dynamics in this case. First off, the feud was partly personal. It was also a feud between the law enforcers and those who broke the law. Let's take a little look at the law enforcers here and see, while they may have been on the right side of the law technically, they weren't exactly what we might call nowadays on the up and up. In fact, one of their jobs, the town marshals in this case, was to go around and collect taxes on the brothels and gambling operations and saloons operating here in Tombstone.
The clash also pitted urban versus rural interest. People like the Earps, especially Northern Republicans, were more interested in mining and in business affairs of the city as opposed to others, including the Cowboys, who were more preoccupied with farming and ranching interest.
There was another factor at play in the gunfight at the OK Corral, namely politics. Now, while it's not cut and dried as far as this side was on this party, this side was on that party, for the most part, you have to remember that practically no one here that lived here in Tombstone was born here. They all migrated from other parts of the United States or from Mexico. The Earps hailed from Illinois. Although Wyatt and Morgan were too young to fight during the Civil War, their older brothers did fight in the Civil War on the side of the Union. Ike Clanton and his brothers, including Billy, did not fight in the Civil War, but their father, Newman Clanton, did. He fought on the side of the Confederacy. Now, the McClary brothers were not from the South. They were from the Midwest, actually New York originally, then from Missouri. And Doc Holliday, of course, was from Georgia, so he certainly was not a Union sympathizer. Tombstone was divided politically between Republicans, most of whom came from the northern states and who would sympathize with the Union during the Civil War, and the Democrats, a lot of whom were Southerners or came here from southern states and were still sympathetic to the Confederacy. The Civil War had only been over for about 16 years when this happened. The Earps and the Cowboys of that era here around Tombstone had an on-again, off-again relationship with each other, mostly off, by the way. What was the trigger? What finally forced or brought about this event? The story's a tad complicated. Although the event happened, the gunfight happened on October 26th of that year, the trigger for that event actually occurred about 7 months prior to the gunfight. If you've seen a lot of old westerns, you know the stagecoach robberies were a problem back then. The principal players involved reaping the benefits of silver mining here were two men named Henry Wells and William Fargo, as in Wells Fargo. They were not too crazy about the idea of their stagecoaches being held up, and so they enlisted the services of the Earps to help them solve these stagecoach robberies. Well, this particular stagecoach robbery was special to Wyatt Earp in a bad way. Not only did it force him to do his job as town marshal, and he had political aspirations of his own, so he thought solving this case might help him and his brothers in attaining those political aspirations. A friend of his, a dear friend of his, a close friend of his, was killed during this robbery. So he had several incentives here. He wanted to avenge the death of his friend. He wanted to do his job. He had political aspirations. He also had the financial incentive that Wells Fargo offered for him to solve this case. Back in those days, publicly funded law enforcement was not nearly as strong and well-equipped, well-funded, and well-trained as they are nowadays. So it was not unusual for big moneyed interests like Wells Fargo to seek out public employees or even private detectives to help them solve their cases.
On the evening of March 15, 1881, a Kinnear and Company stagecoach carrying $26,000 in silver bullion, about $850,000 today, was en route from Tombstone to Benson, Arizona. Bob Paul, who had run for Pima County Sheriff and was contesting the election he lost due to ballot stuffing, was temporarily working as a Wells Fargo shotgun messenger. He had taken the reins and driver's seat in Contention City because the usual driver, Eli Bud Philpott, was ill. Philpott was riding shotgun, literally. Just outside Contention City, a man stepped into the road and commanded them to hold. 3 cowboys attempted to rob the stage. Paul, in the driver's seat, fired his shotgun and emptied his revolver at the robbers, wounding a cowboy later identified as Bill Leonard in the groin. Philpott, riding shotgun, and passenger Pete Rohrig, riding in the rear dickey seat, were both shot and killed. The horses spooked, and Paul could not bring the stage under control for almost 1 mile, leaving the robbers with nothing. The Earp brothers, along with Wells Fargo agent Marshall Williams, Bat Masterson, and Sheriff Johnny Behan, set out to find the robbers. Wells Fargo issued a wanted poster offering a $3,600 reward, about $117,000 today, for the 3 robbers, dead or alive. Robbery of a mail-carrying stagecoach was both a federal crime and a territorial crime, and the posse consisted of both county and federal authorities and deputies.
Wyatt and Morgan's search for the perpetrators in this stagecoach robbery led them to a man named Luther King. They went to King's ranch, or his place of residence, and asked him, look, we know you did this, would you please tell us who may have assisted you, or something like that. King wasn't very responsive at first, and so Wyatt, as he usually did, chose to use force rather than finesse, get the truth out of Luther King, which he eventually did. So in other words, he beat a confession out of King, and he also got King to tell him who some of his associates were.
Another factor that convinced King to tell what he knew came with the Earps telling King that Kate Elder, the girlfriend of Doc Holliday, had been wounded in the robbery, which was not true. Fearful of Holliday's reputation, he confessed to holding the reins of the robbers' horses and identified Bill Leonard, Harry the Kid Head, and Jim Crane as the robbers. They were all known cowboys and rustlers. Luther King was escorted back to Tombstone.
You know how nowadays some street gangs supposedly have their own colors or their own type of clothing to identify them? And the same goes for some outlaw motorcycle clubs, and woe be to the person who wears this without their permission. A similar thing occurred with some of these cowboy groups back in the 1880s, more specifically Ike Clanton's Association of Friends or Confederates. Luther King, when he was confronted by the Earps and when he spilled the information about who assisted him in the stagecoach robbery, Wyatt Earp noticed Luther King's hat. Now, what was significant about hats? First off, most men wore hats back in those days. But in this case, though, the hat had a rattlesnake emblem around it. And Wyatt knew, just as law enforcement officers know today, what a particular symbol stands for and how it associates them with a certain group of people. And Wyatt Earp knew that rattlesnake emblem on the hat identified him as one of Ike Clanton's men. After being told by Luther King that he participated in the stagecoach robbery, and he also fingered a man named Billy Leonard as a person who assisted him, Wyatt goes to Ike Clanton and says, I know it was your guys or one of your guys who pulled the stagecoach robbery. Now, it turned out that Ike Clanton did not sanction this stagecoach robbery. Luther King and Billy Leonard were acting on their own, which is a no-no in some loosely or tightly knit criminal organizations. In fact, Ike Clanton not only denied that it was one or two of his men that pulled off this robbery, he said that he had heard that Doc Holliday had participated in the stagecoach holdup. Luther King was in jail for the stagecoach robbery. In the meantime, Wyatt Earp is setting out looking for Billy Leonard. Now, things get complicated because not only does Ike Clanton identify Doc Holliday as a possible stagecoach robber, so does Doc's dear loving friend, Big Nose Kate Elder. Luther King and Doc Holliday are in jail for the stagecoach robbery. Most likely, one of them is innocent, and most likely it's Doc Holliday who is innocent. Somehow, we don't know how, Luther King is let out of jail. Chances are he either escaped because of shoddy security or some people were bribed to look the other way while he left jail. But it's pretty clear why he was let out. Ike Clanton did not approve of him operating as a lone ranger, no pun intended, in pulling off this robbery. On top of that, Ike Clanton now knew that Luther King was a snitch and had fingered Billy Leonard as one of his participants in the robbery. But for whatever reason, Big Nose Kate changed her tune and recanted her statement that Doc Holliday was involved in the stagecoach robbery, which freed him at least in the eyes of the law. We're not positive what happened to Luther King, but Luther King disappeared. There's some speculation that he was killed by his former cowboy associates, and well, for whatever reason, he vanished. But most likely, he was murdered by the people he once worked with. Wyatt Earp was still determined to find out who had pulled off this stagecoach robbery. And so he did what law enforcement officers do today. He tried to enlist the services of an informant or a snitch. Informants and snitches typically are not exactly law-abiding citizens of their own right. Sometimes law enforcement has to get its hands dirty to find out who pulled off a crime. Wyatt Earp, in a very bold move, decides to go to the top, I guess one might say, in trying to find out who pulled this robbery off. So he has a secret meeting with Ike Clanton. Wyatt has a pretty good idea that Billy Leonard is the person he is looking for. He knows that Ike Clanton has a good idea of where Billy Leonard is. So they secretly meet at night, and Wyatt tells Ike Clanton, if you can tell me where Billy Leonard is, and if we can effect his arrest, you'll get a reward. The Earps take off after Billy Leonard and know where to find him. Someone or something gets in the way that complicates matters quite a bit. Turns out that Billy Leonard and some other people were out to assassinate and rob some ranchers here in Arizona, this area. But the ranchers got word of this plot to assassinate them, and they hired people to kill Billy Leonard and his associates first. So before the Earps can arrest Billy Leonard for the stagecoach robbery, he is killed by someone else. And in Wyatt Earp's mind, the deal with Ike Clanton is now off. So Billy Leonard was killed before Wyatt Earp could make his arrest, and therefore Ike Clanton could not get the reward money he was promised for giving the information. Ike Clanton felt double-crossed. Wyatt Earp said, no deal, no arrest, no reward money. This was the trigger that really started things, or escalated problems, I should say, between Ike Clanton, his people, and the Earps. Ike Clanton had another problem in his hands now. Not only was he out the reward money, but he was afraid that he would meet the same fate as other snitches, and that it would be discovered that he had informed on Billy Leonard to Wyatt Earp. So now he is in fear for his life. Ike Clanton was a braggart, a loudmouth, a drunk, a coward, but he also had a certain charm about him, at least in the eyes of some people. He talked quite a bit and he was able to tell a good story, but now he thinks he's in real trouble with the people that he thinks he has influence with because he gave this information to Wyatt Earp. Now, what he was not really smart enough to realize was that Wyatt Earp was not exactly proud of what he had done either by enlisting a man like Ike Clanton as a snitch. He thought that being seen and being in bed with a guy like this would hurt his chances. So Wyatt Earp told no one about this secret deal between himself and Ike Clanton. October 25th, the night before the gunfight, things are coming to a head, although no one really knows it. Ike Clanton has become increasingly more paranoid about being found out to be a snitch for the Earps. He feels double-crossed by Wyatt Earp. He has a long-standing hatred of the Earps. And so he did what Ike Clanton does. He goes out and starts getting drunk. Supposedly he's in a saloon and he sees Doc Holliday. And according to Clanton, he says that Doc Holliday makes some statement indicating that Holliday knows that he snitched out Billy Leonard for the stagecoach robbery. They have a confrontation out on the street. Clanton continues drinking. Now, normally the Earps would take someone like that, lock them up, let them sleep it off, perhaps take them to court the next day, small fine, and it's over and done with. But for whatever reason, Ike Clanton is not taken into custody that night. An interesting thing the night before the gunfight was that Ike Clanton spent the evening drinking a lot, and playing cards. And one of the men he was playing cards with was Virgil Earp. Virgil Earp had seen Ike Clanton drunk before. He had dealt with drunks lots of times. And so, being a quasi-politician that he was, unlike his brother Wyatt, he thought games of cards, things like that, Ike will calm down. Well, Ike continued his boisterous behavior, not only that night, but throughout the night and the next morning. The morning of October 26th came, and Ike Clanton is still drinking. And he starts making increasingly loud threats that he is going to kill the Earps. The townspeople around Tombstone can hear and observe Ike Clanton making these threats. And several of them, one person in particular, go directly to Virgil Earp and report these threats to him. Virgil Earp is still not taking this very seriously. So he and his brothers confront Ike Clanton on the streets of Tombstone. Confrontation does not go well, as one might expect, and Virgil Earp takes the butt of his rifle and bops Ike Clanton on the head with it. He and his brothers carry Ike Clanton off to jail, where he's held for a few hours. He is taken to Recorder's Court, a police court, around noon that day. Supposedly during the court proceedings, Morgan and Virgil and Wyatt continued to exchange threats and nasty words with Ike Clanton, or he does with them. He is fined $25 and is released. Ike is released from jail, still drunk and still belligerent. He meets up with his younger brother, Billy Clanton. Now, Billy Clanton, by all accounts, is much more easygoing than Ike. In Ike's view, Billy is weaker, actually, but he tries to talk Ike into simply leaving town, saying, we'll leave now, and we'll come back and deal with the Earps later. Besides, it was a very cold, unpleasant day, and Billy Clanton just wanted to get home. So they go to the OK Corral, or the area near the OK Corral, and they are joined by two brothers, also two cowboys, Tom and Frank McClory. Now, by all accounts, Frank McClory was in some respects a quasi-respectable citizen, but he was also a good gunshot. And they're joined by a man named William or Billy Claiborne. The Earps get word of these threats and that the five cowboys are at the OK Corral. They go to the OK Corral to disarm the cowboys. Accounts differ on exactly what the Earps said on their way to the OK Corral about the cowboys, I should say. But we do know one thing, is that Doc Holliday sees his friends headed to the OK Corral and asks if they need help, and they say they do. Virgil Earp has borrowed a shotgun from a local store, and he gives his shotgun to Doc Holliday. And so they proceed to the OK Corral to confront the cowboys and to disarm them.
Near the corner of 4th Street and Fremont Street, the Earps ran into Sheriff Behan, who was trying to mollify both sides. He had left the cowboys and came toward the Earps, though he looked nervously behind him several times. Virgil testified afterward that Behan told them, "For God's sake, don't go down there or they will murder you." Wyatt said Behan told him and Morgan, "I have disarmed them." Behan testified afterward that he had only said he had gone down to the cowboys for the purpose of disarming them. Not that he actually disarmed them. One eyewitness, laundryman Peter H. Faley, testified afterward that Virgil Earp told Behan, "Those men have made their threats, and I will not arrest them, but I will kill them on sight."
When the moment comes, the confrontation comes, some of the Cowboys supposedly are grabbing at their weapons, and so are the Earps. Virgil Earp says something to the effect of, "We don't want that." This part of the gunfight only lasted a few seconds, but it must have seemed like an eternity to the men who were there. I'm sure their lives passed before their eyes, and that's appropriate because 3 of the men would end their life that day.
When Virgil saw the Cowboys, he testified later, he said he immediately commanded the Cowboys to throw up your hands, I want your guns. Virgil and Wyatt both testified they saw Frank McClory and Billy Clanton draw and cock their single-action 6-shot revolvers as a man named Calico Jones escaped down an adjacent alley back towards the OK Corral. Jeff Morey, who served as a historical consultant on the film Tombstone, concluded that the Earps described the situation accurately. What was the physical proximity of the men involved? Contrary to some of the early movie portrayals of the gunfight, the men were close to each other, probably no longer than 10 feet away from each other at first.
Who was the first person to fire? Who was the first person to draw their gun? Who was the person who really initiated this use of force incident, this deadly use of force incident? Accounts differ quite a bit. Let's take a look at what we think happened in those 30 seconds.
The smoke from the black powder used in the weapons added to the confusion of the gunfight in the narrow space. Those loyal to one side or the other told conflicting stories, and independent eyewitnesses who did not know the participants by sight were unable to say for certain who shot first. The 6 or 7 men with guns fired about 30 shots in around 30 seconds. Wyatt testified, Billy Clanton leveled his pistol at me, but I did not aim at him. I knew that Frank McClory had the reputation of being a good shot and a dangerous man, and I aimed at Frank McClory. He said he shot Frank McClory after both he and Billy Clanton went for their revolvers. Billy Clinton and Wyatt Earp fired first. Clanton missed, but Earp shot Frank McClory in the stomach. Doc Holliday shot Tom McClory with a double-barreled shotgun to the chest at close range. Now mortally wounded, McClory staggered a few feet before collapsing. After shooting Tom, Holliday tossed the empty shotgun aside, pulled out his nickel-plated revolver, and continued to fire at Frank McClory and Billy Clanton. Ike Clanton, the primary instigator of this debacle, ran forward and grabbed Wyatt, exclaiming that he was unarmed and did not want to fight. Wyatt responded, "Go to fighting or get away." Clanton ran through the front door of Fly's boarding house and escaped unwounded. Like Ike, Billy Claiborne was unarmed. He and another man in the vicinity, a cowboy named Wes Fuller, who had been at the rear of the lot, also ran from the fight as soon as the shooting began. Morgan Earp shot Billy Clanton in the right wrist, disabling his hand. Wyatt shot Frank McClory in the abdomen. Frank tried and failed to grab his rifle from the scabbard, but lost control of the horse. Frank crossed Fremont Street, firing his revolver instead. Frank and Doc Holliday exchanged shots as Frank moved across Fremont Street, and Frank hit Holliday in his pistol pocket, grazing him. Holliday followed him, exclaiming, "That son of a bitch has shot me and I'm going to kill him." Morgan Earp also fired at Frank. Frank fell to the sidewalk on the east side of Fremont Street. Though wounded, Billy Clanton and Frank McClory kept shooting. One of them shot Morgan Earp across the back in a wound that struck both shoulder blades and a vertebra. Morgan went down for a minute before picking himself up. Either Frank or Billy shot Virgil Earp in the calf. Virgil, though hit, fired his next shot at Billy Clanton. Frank fired twice more before he was shot in the head under his right ear. Billy Clanton was shot in the wrist, chest, and abdomen, and after a minute or two, slumped into a sitting position near his original position at the corner of the Harwood house in the lot between the house and Fly's lodging house. A few moments later, Tom McClory was carried from the corner of Fremont and 3rd into the Harwood house on that corner where he died. Billy Clanton died shortly afterward. Ike Clanton kept running, fleeing the scene of his brother's death. When it was done, Frank and Tom McClory were dead, as was Billy Clanton. Doc Holliday was slightly wounded. Virgil and Morgan Earp were seriously wounded. Wyatt Earp, Ike Clanton, and Billy Claiborne were uninjured.
When the 3 Cowboys were killed, of course, word spread fast. After all, this is a small town. For the most part, it seemed the townspeople were on the side of the Earps. They have ridded our town of some of the worst cowboy elements that we have here. Also have to remember that certain businesses, particularly people who traded in the beef industry, they profited from the Cowboys' illegal activities. And it didn't take long, though, for public opinion to shift away from the Earps on the side of the Cowboys. You have to hand it to Ike Clanton. Although he was not the most honest man in the world, and certainly not a good man by any stretch of the imagination, he was a pretty good propagandist and knew how to use the news media of that day. Made a brilliant move, really. Asked the morticians who took care of the bodies of his brother Billy and the McLaury brothers. He had them placed in open caskets, at least open from the waist up, and they were put on display here in Tombstone. And there was a sign above the open caskets that said "Murder on the Streets of Tombstone." That caused a quick shift in public opinion.
The funerals for 19-year-old Billy Clanton, 28-year-old Tom McLaury, and 33-year-old Frank McLaury were well attended. About 300 people joined the procession to Boot Hill, and as many as 2,000 watched from the sidewalks. The McLaurys were buried in the same grave, and Billy Clanton was buried nearby. The story was widely printed in newspapers across the United States. Most versions favored the Earps. The headline in the San Francisco Examiner was "A Good Riddance."
Another tool in Ike Clanton's propaganda kit was inflaming what we might call class warfare, and also reopening some wounds from the Civil War, which were still very fresh.
Ike Clanton appealed to transplanted Southerners who were still seething over the defeat at the hands of the North in the Civil War. Many ex-Confederates despised the urban Northern Republicans like the Earps, who bullied rural Democratic Southern farmers. Clanton successfully incited this lingering factional resentment. 3 days after the shootout, the ruling of the coroner's jury, convened by Dr. Henry Matthews, neither condemned nor exonerated the lawmen for shooting the Cowboys. William Clanton, Frank and Thomas McLaury came to their deaths in the town of Tombstone on October 26, 1881, from the effects of pistol and gunshot wounds inflicted by Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, Wyatt Earp, and one Holliday, commonly called Doc Holliday.
Something worth noting is that the gunfight at the OK Corral had witnesses besides the people who were involved in the gunfight. If a gunfight like this were to occur today, imagine the witnesses, although probably trying to run for cover if you have any sense, whipping out their cell phones and taking video of this event. This would be the mother of all viral videos. And it's also interesting, at least in my opinion, I suspect that you would see the kind of divide then that you do now. Probably have the pro-law enforcement people siding with the Earps, and you have the anti-law enforcement faction siding with the Clantons. You may have the Republicans, conservatives, and by the way, the Earps were Republicans in those days, not exactly conservative, and you'd have the Democrats siding with the Cowboys, who were led by Ike Clanton, who was associated with the Democratic Party, was sympathetic to the South during the Civil War. Imagine what kind of viral video discussions would go on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook if such an event were to occur today.
Although there was no internet, TV, or radio at the time, news of the gunfight traveled fast and it traveled far.
The gunfight at the OK Corral was not the only crime here in the U.S. that gained worldwide attention and cast a negative light on the country. Just a month before, America had witnessed the assassination of its president for the second time.
President James Garfield had taken office in March 1881. The following July, he was shot by a deranged office seeker in Washington, D.C. President Garfield spent the next 2 months bedridden and dying from not only his wounds, but from inept medical care. He died in September after being transported from Washington, D.C. to the New Jersey shore. President Garfield died 16 years after President Abraham Lincoln died at the hands of an assassin.
In the 1880s, the Western world, including the United States, was witnessing the emergence of mass media for the first time. And that was aided by the fact that now there was, although not the kind of communication we have nowadays with telephones, things like that, or the internet, but telegraphs. And so news that heretofore would have taken days or weeks to make its way across the country, let alone across the ocean to Europe or other countries, can be done pretty quickly now, within a day or so. So the news of the gunfight at the OK Corral was not only big news here in Arizona, which is a territory and not a state at the time, and that's significant, but it reached Washington, D.C. The president at that time was a man named Chester A. Arthur. Now, the news of the gunfight at the OK Corral not only caused a row in media circles back east, say in New York and Washington and Boston, where people love to read of exploits of those primitive redneck Westerners out there in the gunfights. It even reached across the ocean. And that's when a man named J.P. Morgan comes into play. The late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, etc., a few decades after that, was known as the Gilded Age. It was the age of robber barons, and these were rich, ruthless capitalists who have a not so distinguished place in history, but are famous nonetheless. We're talking about men like John Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, Vanderbilt, Stanford, and also J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was looking to expand his footprint on the burgeoning industry of railroads here in the West. And to do that, he needed money. And he needed money from other countries. Now, J.P. Morgan was a close associate or was friends with or acquainted with the government, the royal family in England. And when news reached England about what was happening in the United States with the gunfight at the OK Corral and the assassination of President Garfield a month earlier, made investors, European investors, especially English investors, wary of wanting to invest in the United States. Why would this gunfight cause such a stir? The answer is silver. Now, the United States was only 16 years removed from the Civil War. During the Civil War, the United States had to borrow heavily, the Union and Confederate sides, to finance the war against each other. And they were still trying to repay that debt. And a lot of that debt was owed to European countries, especially Great Britain, the United Kingdom. Also have to remember that silver was the big industry here in Tombstone. J.P. Morgan and others were trying to assure European investors that the American economy was sound. And they were trying to, this is before modern economics now, they were trying to tell them that since Tombstone, Arizona held so much silver, that was what propped up the American economy and made the United States a good investment opportunity. If silver could not be safely mined and transported, it posed problems for anyone wanting to invest in the United States. So these cowboys who were prohibiting the mining and manufacture or transportation of silver, robbing stagecoaches, etc., by gunning down lawmen, in other words, no law and order, they in effect were holding the American economy hostage. Like extremely rich people today, J.P. Morgan had influence in Washington, D.C. You have to look at the president at that time. The president was a man named Chester A. Arthur. Now, Chester Arthur is usually regarded as one of the weakest, if not one of the worst presidents in American history. He assumed the office upon the assassination of President Garfield. The only thing that qualified Chester Arthur to be vice president, a vice presidential candidate, was the fact that he was a close ally of a senator from New York and one of the most powerful people in Washington at that time, a man named Roscoe Conkling. Conkling put forth Arthur's name, or I should say Republicans did, as a compromise vice presidential candidate to try to appease both sides. Upon the death of President Garfield, Chester Arthur takes over. Now, Chester Arthur's main prior experience to becoming vice president was he was head of the customs house in New York. Now, New York has the greatest natural ports in the world. A lot of trade, even to this day, comes through New York City, Manhattan. And so the person who occupied that office, unlike would be the case today, could profit or skim off the top legally of whatever came into the ports in New York. So Chester Arthur was a very wealthy man when he assumed the presidency. He was also a political pawn to people like Roscoe Conkling in New York. J.P. Morgan's influence in the White House was substantial. And from London, when he was hearing this hesitation on the part of European royalty and other European officials and business people to get involved in the United States, investing in the United States, more specifically his railroad interests and his silver interests, contacts President Arthur and says, we're having a hard time doing business over here because of the bad publicity that came from what happened in Arizona with the gunfight at the OK Corral and the follow-up assassinations and so forth. People over in Europe think that the United States is lawless and therefore bad risk as far as investments go. He asks President Arthur, or demands more like it, to have someone look into and straighten out the mess that's Arizona at that time. So President Arthur sort of gets his marching orders from J.P. Morgan. You have to remember at the time, Arizona was a territory and not a state. And so the governor of the Arizona territory was not popularly elected by the people of Arizona. The governor was appointed by the president and therefore had to answer to the president. So President Arthur contacts the territorial governor of Arizona and says, hey, you need to go look into that mess in Tombstone because it's bad for business. And so the governor gets this message and he sends a similar message now to the sheriff of the Tombstone area, and that's Johnny Behan, saying, get to the bottom of this.
4 days after the shootout, Ike Clanton filed murder charges against Doc Holliday and the Earps. Wyatt and Holliday were arrested and brought before Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer. Morgan and Virgil were still recovering at home. Only Wyatt and Holliday were required to post a $10,000 bail, about $330,000 today, which is paid by their attorney Thomas Fitch, local mine owner E.B. Gage, Wells Fargo undercover agent Brett Dodge, and other business owners, appreciative of the Earps' efforts to maintain order. Virgil Earp was suspended as town marshal, pending the outcome of the trial. Justice Spicer convened a preliminary hearing on October 31st to determine if there was enough evidence to go to trial. The prosecution was led by Republican District Attorney Littleton Price, assisted by John Murphy, James Robinson, and Ben Goodrich. They were joined by William McClory, Frank and Tom's older brother, who was also an attorney. The Earps attorney, Thomas Fitch, was an experienced trial lawyer and had earned the reputation as a silver-tongued orator of the Pacific. Spicer took written and oral testimony from several witnesses over more than a month. Accounts by both participants and eyewitnesses were contradictory. Those loyal to one side or the other told conflicting stories, and independent eyewitnesses who did not know the participants by sight were unable to say for certain who shot first. At first, Sheriff Behan seemed to side with the Earps. He didn't always like them, and he had cordial relations with many of the Cowboys in the area, but he sensed that public opinion was with the Earps, and that the Earps were basically on the side of law and order. Then he discovered that his mistress, Josephine Sadie Marcos, was having relations with Wyatt Earp. His loyalty turned completely.
Well, perhaps as a consequence of discovering the affair between Josephine Marcos and Wyatt Earp, Johnny Behan's loyalties shift very quickly and very strongly. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday are now in jail, charged with the murders of the McClory brothers and Billy Clanton. What happens next?
Sheriff Johnny Behan testified that the Cowboys had not resisted, but either threw up their hands and turned out their coats to show they were not armed. Behan's views turned public opinion against the Earps, who were free on bail. He and other prosecution witnesses testified that Tom McClory was unarmed, and Billy Clanton had his hands in the air, and neither of the McClorys were troublemakers. They portrayed Ike Clanton and Tom McClory as being unjustly bullied and beaten by the vengeful Earps on the day of the gunfight. Spicer revoked the bail for Doc and Wyatt and had them jailed on November 7th. They spent the next 16 days in jail. Defense accounts contradicted the testimony of Sheriff Behan. 3 witnesses gave key evidence that swayed Justice Spicer to hold that Virgil had acted within his capacity as town marshal, and that there was insufficient evidence to indict the Earps and Doc Holliday for the murder. Some of the witnesses could be accused of being partial to one side or the other, and other townspeople had been intimidated by Ike Clanton and other Cowboys into not testifying. But H.F. Sills was an engineer who had just arrived in town and knew none of the parties involved. Plus, he was not afraid of either party. The reason? He was dying of tuberculosis and thus did not fear death. Sills corroborated the defense testimony that the Cowboys had pulled their guns first. Addie Borland was a dressmaker whose residence was across Fremont Street from Fly's boarding house. She testified that she saw both sides facing each other, that none of the Cowboys had held their hands up as Ike testified, that the firing was general, and that she had not seen Billy Clanton fall immediately as the Cowboys had testified. Judge J.H. Lucas of the Cochise County Probate Court corroborated Addie Borland's testimony. These witnesses' testimony, especially that of H.F. Sills, a disinterested party, discredited much of the testimony given by Sheriff Johnny Behan, Ike Clanton, and the other Cowboy witnesses. After hearing the evidence, Justice Spicer ruled on November 30th that Virgil, as the lawman in charge for that day, had acted within his office and that there was not enough evidence to indict the men. Spicer criticized Virgil Earp's use of Wyatt and Holliday as deputies. He concluded that no laws were broken. He said the evidence indicated that the Earps and Holliday acted within the law and that Holliday and Wyatt had been properly deputized by Virgil Earp.
As I said at the outset of the broadcast here, the gunfight at the OK Corral in October of 1881 did not end anything. In fact, it was just the beginning. Now, I filmed this at night. This is on the streets of Tombstone here, because that's when this event occurred. 2 months after the gunfight at the OK Corral, Marshal Virgil Earp was walking the streets of Tombstone, probably this street I'm on right now, perhaps on the sidewalk here, when he was ambushed from behind and shot in the back.
Virgil Earp was shot by an unknown assailant. Although it was strongly suspected, and the other Earps are almost certain, that relatives and allies of the Clantons were responsible, no one was arrested or prosecuted.
Although Virgil Earp survived the gunshots he took that night in December, he was crippled for life. Well, if the serious wound inflicted on Virgil Earp was not enough, things would only get worse for the Earps. A few months later, again at night, the youngest of the Earp brothers, Morgan Earp, was shot in the back while playing a game of pool with his brother Wyatt.
Morgan Earp was murdered on March 18, 1882. There was little doubt as to the identity of Morgan Earp's killers. It was Frank Stillwell, who had served as a deputy sheriff under Sheriff Johnny Behan, and Pete Spence, an ally of the Cowboys. The charges against the two did not stick, and they were freed.
With all the killings, all the legal back and forth that had gone on between the Earps and the Cowboys, more specifically Ike Clanton and people associated with him, it's interesting that Wyatt Earp and Ike Clanton had one thing in common, and that is that neither man had any faith in the justice system here in Tombstone. Another development here was the arrival of another Earp brother. Warren Earp came to Tombstone to assist Wyatt in hunting down the murderers Morgan Earp and the men who wounded Virgil Earp. But Wyatt decided the best thing for all involved was to get Virgil Earp and Virgil's family and Josephine Marcos and other people connected with the Earps out of town, and they were going to send them by train to California. Wyatt transports Virgil and the others. They go to Tucson, Arizona, about an hour and a half drive from here. Not sure it's the exact distance, but they're tipped off when they get there that some cowboys are laying in wait for them. And that's when one of the first vendetta murders occurred.
Frank Stillwell was one of the cowboys laying in wait for the Earps at the train station in Tucson. Frank Stillwell was killed at the train station while Ike Clanton did what he did best. He ran away. A coroner ruled that Frank Stillwell had been shot by 5 weapons. One witness said his was the most shot-up body he had ever seen. Arrest warrants for Stillwell's killing were issued for Wyatt Earp, Warren Earp, Doc Holliday, Jack Johnson, and Sherman McMaster. Ultimately, no one was convicted in Stillwell's death.
There was another vendetta murder that kind of secured Wyatt's place in history, and that involved the killing of several men, especially a man named Curly Bill Brocious.
According to Wyatt Earp, in an anonymous report to the Tombstone Epitaph, he was in the lead of a posse when they suddenly came upon the Cowboys' camp at Iron Springs, Arizona. The Cowboys began firing just as Earp dismounted. Wyatt Earp, along with Doc Holliday and 3 other men, engaged the Cowboys. Another gunfight had ensued. This time, one of the combatants was Curly Bill Brocious. 18 months prior, Wyatt Earp had protected Brocious against a mob ready to lynch him for killing Town Marshal Fred White, and then Earp provided testimony that helped spare Brocious from a murder conviction. Now, Brocious fired at Earp with a shotgun from about 50 feet, but he missed. Earp returned fire over his horse using a 22-inch 10-gauge shotgun. He killed Brocious with a load of buckshot to the stomach, nearly cutting him in half. Brocious fell into the water at the edge of the spring.
Up to a certain point, Wells Fargo had been the Earp's best friend. They financed his activities. They paid him rewards for his taking out of the Cowboys. But at some point, their devotion or their allegiance to Wyatt Earp faded as well. We don't know exactly what the psychology was here with Wyatt Earp. But at a certain point, once he lost the support of Wells Fargo and perhaps decided it was just simply time to move on, he gave up his vendetta without killing Ike Clanton. What happened to the principal people who survived this incident? Let's start with looking at what happened to Ike Clanton. Although he did not suffer death at the hands of Wyatt Earp, he did meet a fate befitting his occupation.
Ike Clanton continued his life as a cattle and horse thief. He was killed on May 31st, 1887 by Jonas Brighton, a detective hired to track him and his compatriots down. Virgil Earp never fully recovered from the gunshot wounds he suffered in Tombstone, but he recovered sufficiently to have jobs in law enforcement, private security, and other business ventures in California, Colorado, and Arizona before moving to Nevada, where he passed away in 1905. Like Wyatt and Warren Earp, Doc Holliday was initially charged in the death of Frank Stillwell. Wyatt Earp believed, perhaps correctly, that Holliday would not get a fair trial in Tucson. Wyatt contacted his friend Bat Masterson in Colorado. He asked Masterson to issue some phony criminal charges against Holliday, which would necessitate Holliday being extradited to Colorado, at which time Masterson persuaded the governor to intervene on Holliday's behalf, which he did, and Doc Holliday walked away a free man. Doc Holliday was also suspected of the death of another of the Cowboys, Johnny Ringo, even though Ringo's death was officially ruled a suicide. Doc Holliday was also tried and acquitted of the murder of a man named William Allen in Colorado. The dispute stemmed from a debt owed by Holliday. Doc Holliday had one last meeting with his friend Wyatt Earp before his death from tuberculosis in a Colorado sanatorium in 1887. The location of his gravesite is unknown, with some believing he was buried in Colorado and others thinking his remains were transported to his hometown, Griffin, Georgia.
Well, eventually the Fura and the warrants and the killings associated with the gunfight at the OK Corral went away. The legend or the myth of Wyatt Earp was just starting to be built.
Starting in 1884, Wyatt Earp and Josephine Marcos traveled the West, mostly in California, spending time in San Diego and San Francisco. For the next 12 years, Wyatt Earp made money in gold prospecting, horse racing, gambling, other business ventures, and from time to time in law enforcement.
Well, as an old man, Wyatt Earp was very well known nationally because of what had happened here in Tombstone and in Dodge City as well. One way he decided to cash in on that notoriety was to serve as a referee of a boxing match that occurred in San Francisco. Unfortunately for Wyatt Earp, this turned out not to be a good move on his part.
Controversy followed Wyatt Earp everywhere he went. On December 3rd, 1896, he refereed a heavyweight boxing championship bout between Bob Fitzsimmons and Tom Sharkey in San Francisco. Earp had extensive experience refereeing fights, and his fame brought enormous attention to the already highly anticipated bout. During the 8th round, Earp awarded the match to Sharkey, claiming that Fitzsimmons had delivered a low blow. Many were outraged at Earp's decision. An investigation was conducted, and Earp was never charged with a crime, though his reputation was severely tarnished. In 1896, gold was discovered in Alaska, which had been a U.S. territory since 1867. The find precipitated the Klondike Gold Rush and prompted a mad rush among fortune hunters. Wanting to escape the negative notoriety from the Sharkey-Fitzsimmons fight, Wyatt and Josephine made the 2,500-mile trip to Alaska, eventually settling in Nome. As usual, Wyatt Earp profited indirectly from the Klondike Gold Rush, operating a saloon and a gambling house. He was arrested several times in Alaska, usually for fighting or interfering with an arrest, but each instance was settled with either a fine or a short jail stay. But also as usual, his stay in Alaska would not last long. In 1901, by now 53 years old, Wyatt returned to Southern California, taking Josephine with him, and where he would, by serendipity, establish his legacy.
Well, toward the end of his life, in his 70s and broke most of the time, Wyatt Earp was desperate for money, and he also craved the attention and success and notoriety as a public figure he had always wanted. Fortunately for him, by accident really, he moved to Southern California in the early 19-teens. And it just so happened that the Hollywood film industry was in its infancy then. And the top film genre of that time, silent pictures, were Westerns.
American Westerns were one of the country's biggest cultural exports in the first decades of the 20th century. In the minds of many people, both inside and outside the U.S., those films represented American culture. While living near San Bernardino, Wyatt Earp spent considerable time, especially in summers, in Los Angeles and Hollywood, usually when Josephine was engaged in religious activities out of state.
Wyatt Earp was a consultant on many early Hollywood Westerns. In fact, he developed friendships with well-known names from that period, William S. Hart and Tom Mix among them. It's also believed that a young man named Marion Michael Morrison, whose stage name or active name was John Wayne, worked as a stagehand and was acquainted with Wyatt Earp, although the two were not exactly good friends, and Wayne's career was just getting started. But supposedly, John Wayne said in later years that his cowboy persona was based largely on his interactions and observations with Wyatt Earp. So you see, Wyatt Earp was a huge figure in terms of American culture because he played a big role in not only shaping his legacy, but our perceptions of the American West in the 19th century.
In addition to William S. Hart and Tom Mix, John Ford, the director of some of Hollywood's greatest westerns, interacted with Wyatt Earp and drew some of his inspirations for his films from Earp. The biggest star in John Ford's films was John Wayne. Some of the greatest western films ever made were products of the John Wayne-John Ford collaboration, including Stagecoach, a topic with which Wyatt Earp was very familiar, Fort Apache, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, The Searchers, and How the West Was Won. While he did not single-handedly invent the American Western film, Wyatt Earp, one of the few living holdovers from the Old West, did much to create the perceptions and myths of the American West, usually making himself look heroic in the process. Thanks to his work in Hollywood, Wyatt Earp secured his place in American history, and more importantly, in American folklore, as a tough, honest, incorruptible, no-nonsense American lawman. He started work on an autobiography in the 1920s, but it was not published. Wyatt Earp died on January 13, 1929, at age 80 in Los Angeles. William S. Hart and Tom Mix served as pallbearers.
Perhaps the man who made the greatest contribution to the myth that was Wyatt Earp and is Wyatt Earp was a man named Stuart Lake.
In 1931, Stuart Lake published a book titled Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, a flattering biography heavily tinged with Wyatt Earp's version of his life and exploits. The book was a massive bestseller and inspired several films about Wyatt Earp. The books, plays, movies, and TV programs surrounding Wyatt Earp are too numerous to name, but among the most famous are Law and Order, a a 1932 film with Walter Houston, the first film to depict the gunfight. Frontier Marshal, a 1939 film starring famed Western actor Randolph Scott. My Darling Clementine was directed by John Ford and was based on Stuart Lake's biography of Earp. Henry Fonda portrayed Earp in glowing fashion. The popular image of the gunfight at the OK Corral was Wyatt Earp's version, never minding his story was largely fictional, including the fictional death of all the Cowboys and Doc Holliday. Other efforts include The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, a TV series which ran from 1955 to 1961 with Hugh O'Brien in the title role, and Gunfight at the OK Corral, a 1957 film with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. A 1968 episode of the classic futuristic science fiction TV series Star Trek, called Spectre of the Gun, featured a fascinating depiction of the gunfight, with the show's main characters surreally transported back in time as the 5 cowboys squaring off against the Earps and Doc Holliday. In Star Trek, the Earps are the villains. It falsely implies that Ike Clanton was killed in the gunfight. As Hollywood has tried in recent decades to portray somewhat more realistic and less sanguine versions of many historical events, portrayals of Wyatt Earp have evolved as well. Kurt Russell portrayed him in Tombstone. Released in 1993, the film portrayed Earp favorably, and the OK Corral gunfight was portrayed with more accuracy than previous film reenactments. Wyatt Earp, released in 1994, featured Kevin Costner in the title role. While it portrayed Earp in less mythical fashion, it was criticized as too dark, too dull, and too plotting.
Well, the people who told Ed Shiflin that he would only find his own tombstone here were wrong. He struck it rich, as did many people here in Tombstone. But after the Gunfight at the OK Corral saga, there were problems mining silver here. And without the mining of silver, this town was pretty much running dry on everything. And so it all but went away. But as you can guess now, eventually transformed itself into a very popular tourist attraction here in Arizona.
Today, Tombstone, Arizona is a preserved historic Old West town, offering attractions like Victorian-themed shops and museums, such as the Tombstone Courthouse Museum and the Birdcage Theater. Visitors can take stagecoach rides, Pan for Gold, and visit the Boot Hill Cemetery just outside of town where some of the OK Corral combatants are buried. The highlight of the Tombstone experience is a daily reenactment of the gunfight. Dark humor and audience involvement are part of that experience.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in. Wyatt and Morgan's search for the holdup, meaning this robbery, stagecoach robbery, led them to a man named, I forgot his